No one said solving these problems were going to be easy. And no one said there won't be suffering along the way. There will be suffering. It will be hard. It will be a big challenge. Right now, we have Democrats who are agreeing to a $4.5 billion package that will help with the border crisis. A record number of families and migrants are heading towards the border. They're crossing the border. They're in extremely dangerous situations. It doesn't make sense to just leave them because people have died, and that's the story we're looking at now. Apparently, it doesn't make sense to put them in detention centers either because the conditions are really bad. So I don't know what the solution is. What I can say, though, is that one thing we can do is provide the funding requested by law enforcement, Border Patrol, ICE, whatever, to do something to alleviate the tensions and the stress. The answer is not do nothing. I saw this story and I got really mad. I did. Border Patrol finds 4 bodies, including 3 children in South Texas. The body of a 20-year-old woman was found together with the children, the sheriff said. Whose fault is this? There have been people who have died in the custody of CBP. It is not the fault of CBP that these children showed up sick and dying. However, there is at least a little bit of responsibility. Maybe we could have done more. They were in the custody of our law enforcement. Maybe something could have been done. But for the most part, people are being incentivized to go on dangerous journeys where they're dying. And so if we did nothing, the same outcome would likely have happened. I don't like the idea that there are a bunch of people in cramped these cramped, detention centers with no running water, nowhere to sleep. It sounds terrifying. At the same time, what do we do? The Democrats don't have an answer. Trump does. He wants to build a wall. Maybe it doesn't make sense. I don't know. Like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer said it was immoral. Great. Well, you still have record families coming, so at least propose something. Finally, we're on the same page. Most Democrats and Republicans are agreeing to do this package because we need funding for these facilities. Except the progressive Democrat wing are refusing, and they say not $1. So I'm going to say, yeah, this is partly their fault because they're refusing to step up, because they're pandering, because they're signaling to their base instead of doing what needs to be done and making the hard choices. The answer is not do nothing. Because when you do nothing, you get this. Families that are being encouraged to take these journeys in increasing numbers because for whatever reason, they think they can make it in if they just come now. Because more and more are coming, and because other Democrats are basically saying no ICE, no detention centers, and no border barrier, and no border security. So what do you get? Literally open borders, if that's the case. Well, most Democrats aren't okay with that, and that's why they're on board with this funding. They've dragged their feet for the most part, but I can respect that they're here now. But what about Cortez, who tweeted not $1, who said they want empathy and compassion over detention centers? What does that even mean? I don't know. All they do is obstruct and offer nothing in exchange. But you know what? They rally their base when they do it, and this is the story we get. It's actually a rather short story, and it's actually rather infuriating, maddening, and sad and heartbreaking. Border Patrol agents found 4 bodies, including 3 children near the Rio Grande River in South Texas on Saturday, Hidalgo County Sheriff Eddie Guerra said. 2 of the children were infants and 1 was a toddler. Guerra said a 20-year-old woman was also found. The deaths come amid a huge influx of undocumented immigrants at the southwest border and demonstrate how treacherous it is to journey, often on foot, to the U.S. from Mexico and Central America. The bodies were found southeast of Anzalduas Park in the Las Paloma Wildlife Management Area, just north of Reynosa, Mexico, and south of McAllen, Texas, Guerra said. He said deputies were awaiting FBI agents to lead the investigation. More than 132,000 people were stopped while crossing the border illegally or presenting themselves at legal ports of entry in the month of May, the most in 13 years, U.S. CBP officials said. At least 7 children are known to have died at the border since last year, though they were in CBP custody at the time. The most recent death of a 7-year-old Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez occurred last month after the boy was diagnosed with the flu. What would have happened to these children if CBP wasn't there? In fact, I believe they would have been worse off for it. It's not like custom and border. People like a lot of these Democrats are trying to present this image of concentration camps. They want you to believe that these people, these children are being round up and put on train carts and shipped off to, a worse situation than they were in before. But I would argue, at least in these facilities, there is some kind of accountability. I think these facilities sound horrifying. If you've done any reading about them, they call them the freezer. One of them is called the freezer. But what's the alternative? Children wandering through the wilderness. And what happens? Probably died of exposure. These people were probably out in the wilderness and they didn't have resources. They were cold, and people don't realize you can die from exposure very, very quickly. One of the first things you need when you're out in the middle of nowhere is shelter. And I don't want to act like I know what happened. And I also want to make sure I stress the story from NBC News does make it seem like these are undocumented migrants. It's possible they aren't. It is. I really doubt it considering where they were found, but let's just entertain the fact that we don't have all the details here. I bring this story up not to make accusations about this particular instance, but to highlight an example. 7 children have died, and that is 7 children too many. These 3 children more, it makes 10, I believe, and that is 10 children too many. The answer isn't to do nothing, because they will still, listen, if we followed through with Ocasio-Cortez's plan, Rashida Tlaib, Aina Presley, etc., their not one more dollar plan, we get this. We get a mother and 3 children wandering through the wilderness and dying. That is not a solution. We need to disincentivize this behavior. We need to make it an impossibility. We need to say, you cannot do this, because if people are given the opportunity to take the risk, they will, and then they die. I don't know what the answer is to the border crisis. I don't. And first of all, I shouldn't have to know, and most people shouldn't have to know. It's just an issue of, we've identified the problem. We have seen people lose their lives. It is too many, and something needs to be done. Trump has come up with a border barrier. Perhaps that will work. He's operating now on the advice of CBP and ICE officials, and here's what they've requested. Homeland Security have requested certain funding and things like that. So, okay, maybe that's what we should do. Democrats, what do you propose? Well, they dragged their feet, but at least they're here now saying, okay, fine, let's do something. At least there are Democrats who are saying these children should not have died. But what about these activist organizations like Common Dreams? They say, not one more dollar, even as Trump postpones raids. Ocasio-Cortez, Omar, Presley, and Tlaib vow to oppose all funding for hateful border agenda. Yes, because providing funding to make sure that children aren't losing their lives on the border is hateful. That's what they're doing. That's the game they're playing. I assure you, there are probably CBP and ICE officials who are bad people, because bad people exist. But I do not believe, for a moment, CBP officials on average are laughing maniacally when they hear these stories. I'm willing to bet when these children died in the custody of CBP, you probably had a lot of officers sweating bullets, crying, and probably loaded with anxiety. People don't seem to realize this, that, you hear these stories about bad cops. And I refer to this as like the scaling problem. If you have I've used the example of iPhones before, but let's use the example of cops. If you have 100 police officers in your town, and one officer shoots somebody, and it's a questionable shooting, people say, well, it was one guy. Scale up that same percentage to, 10,000 cops, and now you've got substantially more, instances. People hear about these and they act like it's everything all the time. But I assure you, in most circumstances, I don't want to assure you, but I'd be willing to bet, considering I know people who worked in law enforcement. I don't want to act like I know better than anybody else, but I'm sure after these things happen, these people are, they need therapy, okay? People who go to war need therapy. It's not like you're just like, haha, somebody's dead. No. I'd be willing to bet these CBP people they freak out, and they feel guilt, and they probably feel trauma, because nobody wants to see a child die. The very few people who do are out of their mind, and we tend to lock those people up. Law enforcement aren't those people. In fact, many people join law enforcement because they want to do good for their community. I think there are a lot of people, they get jaded. Absolutely, law enforcement can be jaded, angry, it can become abusive, but that is the exception, not the rule. The point I'm trying to say is, how many stories do we have to hear about people losing their lives, about children losing their lives? I'll tell you what, when the deaths occurred in CBP custody, they immediately blamed law enforcement. Okay, well, if CBP didn't pick them up, the kids were sick. Okay? They were better off in the custody of CBP who were trying to do something to save them. Was it perfect? No. So apparently one of the stories, they didn't get to the kid in time. They didn't know the kid was sick, something like that. But what would have happened without CBP? They'd just died in the desert. And there you go. Here's your story. Here is the story for the Democrats, for specifically for Cortez and her the progressive wing. This is your story of what happens when people aren't in custody. They likely, I'm going to assume, died of exposure. Whatever happened, their bodies were found. They lost their lives. The journey was dangerous. It shouldn't have happened. It is illegal in the first place. You know, let's move on from these stories, because I've got some other things I want to point out about the virtue signaling of the left and how it's driving me nuts. This is from a few days ago. Isn't it really funny? Just 2 days ago, Common Dreams was talking about, I'm not going to accuse I would assume Common Dreams supports Cortez, but they call it a hateful border agenda. Oh, okay. Explain to me what it means then when this woman and her kids are dead. Is that what you wanted? You didn't want funding for CBP. You didn't want funding for the facilities. You didn't want law enforcement to be able to find these people and bring them in and give them at least Mylar blankets. At least. Is this preferable? I ask this seriously to the Democrats on the far left and other far left activists. Was this the preferable outcome? And I mean that with full sincerity. You tell me. You tell me what we should be doing. So, Beto O'Rourke, virtue signals. He tweets, "I'm going to Homestead on Thursday. This administration's inhumane policies of separating families and putting kids in camps must end." A Washington Post immigration reporter said most kids in Homestead arrived in the U.S. without parents. They're there until they can be placed with a parent or sponsor. Washington Post reporter. But once again, a Democrat signaling to their base, saying Orange Man bad. Is this the outcome you wanted? Is this what you expected to happen? You're upset that they would actually put people in holding facilities. I don't like the idea of children being separated from their parents. I also don't like the idea of people trafficking children. I don't know what you do. These people don't have the same documentation we would. Even in the U.S., a guy with his kid, how do you prove it's really your kid? It's a challenge. It is. So what do you do? Honestly, I don't know, but I'm all ears. This, I'll tell you what, is not the solution. Because I would propose this. I would much rather these 3 kids be in a chain link fence, chained area under a Mylar blanket than dead in the woods. I don't know what the alternative is. But I'll tell you what one alternative could be. Funding. And if the Democrats and Republicans have agreed to it, why is the far left obstructing? Because at least then they could maybe have better beds. Some of the facilities are actually not that bad. The Democrats like to show the worst of the worst in terms of facilities, some of them operating under Obama. And yes, they're not all that bad. Some of them are. Well, let's put funding towards it. I am willing to have my tax dollars go to at least protecting the lives of the people who are here now. Mr. Eric Swalwell, the final thought for this morning segment. He said, if you're Hispanic, there's nothing Donald Trump won't do to break up your family, cage your children, or erase your existence with a weaponized census. And there's nothing we won't do in the streets, courts, and at the ballot box to stop him. This man disgusts me. This is the most vapid, sociopathic post I've seen in a really long time. I do not believe for a moment Eric Swalwell cares at all about anyone. He is politicking. What did he just say? Redheaded Libertarian on Twitter says, Eric Swalwell, the only thing lower than your polling numbers are the expectations you have for minorities. The implication that all Hispanics are illegal immigrants who are trafficking children or something to that effect. Or even to be a little bit lighter on it. The idea that Trump is targeting all Hispanics is one, completely dishonest, or implies that he really thinks all Hispanics are illegal immigrants who are skirting the law and hiding here in the U.S. I assure you, that's absolutely not true. There are a lot of great American citizens who were born here through multiple generations who are Hispanic. The idea, it's a virtue signal. It solves nothing. And you know what? People don't play that game. Some people do. This person, Douglas Church, tweeted, "We seem pretty uncaged if you ask me. There's a smiling, happy family." There's one guy who says, "I'm Hispanic and 100% Trump support and 100% Trump supporter, silly." So someone said, "I'm embarrassed for you. Yikes. My legally immigrated and naturally born Hispanic friends will disagree. Eric, I'm Hispanic and behind our president." The idea That the Democrats think they can lump everyone into a single category, to me, is grossly offensive. And I'll tell you why it's grossly offensive, because I've experienced bigotry from these people from both sides of the political aisle. Moderate liberals and moderate Republicans tend to be fine. But you know what freaks me out? Moderate conservatives, centrist types, and even staunch conservatives, to me, have not been bigoted towards me about my family, and they have not made assumptions about what my family does. They've treated me with respect. There's an ever-increasing movement on the mainstream left, mainstream Democrats, which really does worry me. This is Eric Swalwell. He's not necessarily one of the far-left Democrats. He tweets about as a capitalist. But they're embracing identitarianism, and that freaks me out. Because I know where that leads for people like me, for my family, for how they will treat us. And I'm not happy with that. I'm not happy with the idea that he thinks simply if you're Hispanic, you're a target, and he can put you in a group of people who... That's the assumptions they make. I'll stop there. They make the assumption that your race defines you. I do not like that. And that's why, even though policy-wise, I am center-left, culturally, I am not aligning with these fringe identitarian weirdos. So I'll end by saying one important thing. To the Democrats who have stood up and said, we're going to do a bipartisan bill, you have my respect, and I wish you luck. Please, get this bill done. That is amazing that we have bipartisan support for it. To the far-left Democrats, I think this is on you. You're obstructing for the sake of looking good to a fringe urban base. A group of people who live in cities with silver spoons in their mouths. And I mean that literally. Oh, not literally a silver spoon, but I mean I'm not exaggerating when I say, according to numerous reports, these woke identitarian leftists tend to make make more than $100,000 per year on average. That's who's pandering. That's who they're pandering to. That's who's pushing for these policies that result in dead kids. Let's see if anyone wants to advertise on this video. This problem, I think, will not get better. But I think it's important to break... the mainstream, more like centrist Democrat types have finally broken the ranks and said, okay, Republicans, we've got to get this aid package. The far left is resistant because the far left has been at odds in a civil war with the more moderate and incumbent Democrats. They're going to resist the Democrats because they are actually opposed to each other. I think we have three parties: the Republican, the Democrats, and the far left Democrats. Because the far left Democrats and the more mainstream centrist moderate corporate types, they're fighting each other. So the Democrats oppose Republicans because they refuse to give Trump a win. And Ocasio-Cortez and her progressive wing are opposing the bipartisan bill because they don't want the incumbent Democrats to have a win either. Politicking is causing people to lose their lives. So I can give my praise to the Democrats who are signed on to this package to try and help people. You have my respect. As for Ocasio-Cortez, Presley, Omar, and Tlaib, absolutely not. Some of this blame falls on you. I'm not going to be so hyperbolic to play a stupid political game and say, this is all your fault. No. I obviously don't think it was your intention. I think you have good intentions, but the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And it's about time you woke up to the fact that as long as these families keep trying to make these trips, these stories will keep happening. And you can complain all day and night about the conditions, but if you block funding for these camps, I shouldn't even call them camps, detention centers, if you block the funding that goes to them, what do you think is going to happen? The people there will continue to suffer, and the people trying to cross the border will lose their lives. But you know what? Maybe that's the political game. They want it to happen. They want the conditions to get worse and worse and then point to it and say, see, we told you. If you're the one blocking the funding, that is on you. The horrible conditions are now on you, Ocasio-Cortez. If these detention centers are getting bad, if these children don't have beds or toothbrushes or running water, well, there was bipartisan support for funding, but you refused. So that's your fault. I'm not going to put the people who lose their lives on you. They've chosen to take that journey, and it's dangerous. And we need to do something to disincentivize that behavior. It's complicated. But I'll leave it there. Let me know what you think. Comment below. Stick around. The next segment will be at 1 p.m., and I will see you all then.